This research, still at the beginning stage, stems from a university project which I took part in, originally devolved in researching female artists recognized between the 14th and 18th century. It is then that I became fascinated with the figure of Plautilla Nelli, a Dominican nun who was active in 16th century Florence between 1524 and 1588, who served as the priora of the convent of Santa Caterina da Siena in Cafaggio 3 times, and was also, according to the literature which is available to us, mistress of a bottega which flourished under her rule and counted no less than 12 named nuns within it, 6 of them explicitly her pupils, who would also carry on her legacy after her death. My talk today will be devoted to something which emerged as I researched Plautilla. All of the historical sources which I have found so far, and which have passed judgment on her and her work, either belong to religious orders, that of the Dominicans especially, which was her own, or to the traditionally defined artistic literature, which have been more than one occasion contributed to romanticizing her life and work. Secular contributions, however significant, have not been many. As a result, Plautilla has often been praised as the first female image maker of Renaissance Italy, but in-depth research to match that status has been little developed. By reconstructing Nelli's life and career through factual sources and offering a general overview of the context in which she operated, I wish to expand on the existing testimonies. It is important to note that I do not wish to pass judgment myself here today on the figure of Plautilla. I do, however, intend to assess her stature and awareness of herself and her work within the art scene of the time, and most interestingly, offer for debate which issues are still unresolved about her. It is necessary to retrace her steps on earth through what has been recorded in official documents prior to her entry in convent, in the monastery's records once she was formally accepted inside, and finally, but perhaps most importantly, in the paintings and drawings she signed herself. All of these combined are the only facts which, in my view, we can assess as unquestionably true. The genealogy of the Nelli family is fairly well documented. Aside from the date of birth, which is still unknown, she was baptized with the name of Polisena Margherita Nelli to honor her paternal grandmother in the parish of San Felice in Oltrarno in the Santo Spirito quarter on January 29, 1524, as the daughter of Francesca Calandri, daughter as well of Pier Maria Calandri, who had served as prior during the downfall of the Medici, and who was associated with a minor guild of armorers and sword makers, and Piero di Luca Nelli, son of Niccolò Nelli, who have both been on record as being merciai, mercers, of that same parish, and having dealings with many monasteries of the area. Francesca unfortunately died of the plague in October 1530, and according to the Documenti del Contagio collected by the Poligrafo Gargani, and their father soon remarried that same year to another resident of the Santo Spirito quarter, Francesca Michelozzi, possibly a kinswoman of the celebrated architect. His testament dates back to August 19, 1534, bequeathing his estate to his 2 daughters, and includes a clause that addressed their eventual marriage or entry into convent. What few think when dealing with the issue of nuns and convents is that while sending young women here was certainly a solution to dowry problems, the families couldn't quite completely dispense of these issues, as becoming a sposa Christi was still a marriage and thus required equivalent monetary compensation to the Church of St. Peter's. Once inside, the women led, of course, contemplative lives, sheltered from the dissolution of the outside world. However, they still followed closely the regola, or rule of their convent, of their order, and thus were educated and instructed accordingly. This is why at the beginning of the modern age, many, actually the majority of the monasteries were considered aristocratic institutions, and also why, as the seminal opus Monaca, Moglie, Serva, Cortigiana suggests, entering a convent was a respectable and at times preferred choice. It wasn't at all unusual for widowed parents, as was the case for Piero Nelli, to send young daughters to the convents to be raised instead of them. The Florentine term used for the custom is inserbanza, which means keeping them until a certain point in which they either formally entered the convent or they were sent back to their families to marry. Because of Piero's previous dealings with the convent of Santa Caterina da Siena, where Plautilla would eventually enter, is on record as being a tradesman of the convent as early as the 1530s. It is possible he chose this convent for his two daughters for this reason. In here, Plautilla is recorded as having participated in the Vestizione in November 1538 and to have completed her profession and solemn vows by the end of the following year, 1539, at age 15. Also, Plautilla, for the convent of Santa Caterina, the rule was the Direttorio per le Terziarie Collegiate da Siena in Firenze, written and distributed by Fra Roberto Baldini da Gagliano in 1509, so only 30 years before Plautilla entered the convent. In here, it is stated that nuns can and should be allowed to pursue the art of mining manuscripts as a source of income to support the institution. This should not come as anything new, as indeed all the forms of art traditionally considered minor, that is, engraving, mining, embroidering, have always been considered a noble intellectual pursuit for all gentlewomen. At this time, another nun was possibly next of kin to Plautilla's stepmother, Suor Cecilia Michelozzi, was on record as being the resident pharmacist, and it is possible that she was the first to initiate her in the art of preparing pigments. However, we do not know for certain. During the 50 years in which she resided in the convent, she served as prioress 3 times, and in between her mandates, she cultivated her bottega work. Interestingly, in the Direttorio, there is no mention of the office of Madre Pettora. She will call herself Dipintora in later records, and not even of the Maestra del Lavoro, a common task in other monasteries. However, scholar Catherine Turrell cites one nun in a 1576 transaction, Suor Maria Clemente, who calls herself La Pittora, as she was responsible for the oversight of manufacture and sale of images, both painted and sculpted. My question then is if the office of Madre Pittura existed prior to Nelli. As of right now, we do not know. Once inside the convent, Plautilla's hand appears at work during her terms as priora in entries as trivial as grocery lists and as valuable as a record of sales. This, for example, is an entry recording her sale of a painting to the convent of Santa Lucia, and in many she will define them di suo lavoro, or indeed di lor lavoro, done by her and le compagne of the bottega. As monasteries were self-sufficient, even more so after August 20th, 1575, when news arrived from Rome of the enforcement of the cloister rule, these entries are precious testimonies of daily female life led quietly behind the scenes. Most especially, though, her hand appears in the signatures of the only two works we can unquestionably claim as hers, Plautilla Facebat in the Pentecoste, only visible with X-ray due to the degrading of the pigments through time, which is a standard humble term to define a work thought to be still in progress, and Ora te pro pictora, which you can see here on the bottom right corner, which is the female declination of Fra Bartolomeo's traditional signature. In addition to this, in the top right corner, you can find her name on the front and on the back of two drawings preserved at the Gabinetto delle Stampe dei Disegni degli Uffizi as Plautilla Allieva del Frate, so pupil of the friar, and also as the owner of the transcription of the life of Gerolamo Savonarola, completed by her elder sister, Petronilla, who took the vows 2 years before her and was also a nun at that same convent. The devotion to the Savonarolan cause is an important fact in framing of Nelli's life and career. Her father and many of her compagne belonged to Piagnoni families akin to the cause, and the monastery of Santa Caterina was quite possibly among the most fervid centers of Savonarolan devotion in Florence. It is important to note that Savonarola was in favor of artistic and creative practices so long as they were done with simplicitas, which is a term used to strip works of decorative abundance and individuality, if you will, in favor of concentrating on the real religious meaning behind them. So devotion was always at the forefront of his thoughts and his prayers. Petronilla, thought to be a talented writer in many of these records, transcribed and embellished with folklore the tale of the friar, as many testimonies confirmed through the centuries. The monography was still testimony to be in the convent by the late 19th century and accessible to view by Giovanna Pierattini, who is the only monographer of Nelli to this day in 1938. It has since disappeared from view, so we do not know where that might be. Because of the special emphasis placed on religious meaning and dignity, the art of mining was listed in the Regula as an honorable and worthwhile occupation for the collegiate of the convent. The beginning of Plautilla's career was likely within this tradition. She is recorded as a talented miner in various testimonies. For example, in the second edition of Vasari's Lives in 1578, in the life of Roberta de Rossi, the sculptor, who was the only woman alongside Plautilla was granted description by Vasari. Serafino Razzi, in his treatise on illustrious predicatori, his testimony I consider particularly credible because he was the third of three siblings, the first of whom, Silvano, had collaborated with Vasari on his writings, and the second, Maria Angelica, took the veil as a sister in the convent of Plautilla prior to her first mandate as priora. And again, in Rucellai's writing, a kinsman of the founder of the convent, Suor Lucia Bartolini Rucellai, who laid the first stone of the monastery on September 30th, 1500. All of this has led scholars to believe that we can indeed attribute these two works of Mineo to Plautilla. However, of course, we cannot know for certain if these were indeed made by her. They are the initials 565 and 566 of the Antiphonarium now preserved at the Museo di San Marco, estimated to have been made between 1545 and 1557, depicting the presentation of Jesus to the temple in two acts, one of which where we can see two nuns below in prayer, which is the top right one. The sources I have cited earlier have been instrumental in reconstructing the bottega which Plautilla headed for years. Razzi enumerates 6 nuns within it, including his sister, Maria Angelica, who was talented at fashioning angels that are attested to being asked by patrons such as Francesco Pitti, who addressed a letter to Illustrissima Sor Francesca Billi, mia parente carissima Santa Caterina in 1573, and also in Modesto Bigliotti, who authored the Chronicle of Santa Maria Novella, who confirms the presence of numerous nuns at work, and again, also in a number of incomes that are registered. What has made matters murkier in establishing the value of the bottega, if again we consider the forma mentis of the time in which dilettantism, self-support, and devotion all played a relevant role in the matter, were the accounts provided by Fra Vincenzo Marchese in the 19th century, who attested that in 1812, when the convent was suppressed by Napoleonic forces, troops found within it what was considered the lost mannequin of Fra Bartolomeo, credited by Vasari as the inventor of a particularly anatomically accurate wooden model that he had fashioned himself. This was again testified as true by Vittorio Mariani, who wrote in the late 1880s, and by Pierattini again in 1938, who identified the lost mannequin as the one in the Collezione Gorga, who was after the Second World War bequeathed to the Italian government in 1948. However, this mannequin has since again disappeared from view, and we cannot know for certain if this mannequin was indeed the one who was recovered or if there ever was one. This issue of the lost mannequin was also probably found as true because of what has long been considered a fact about the training of Plautilla. However, this is only supported by Vasari's description and by stylistic similarity traced by later scholars. According to Vasari, Fra Bartolomeo left his collection of drawings to his pupil, Fra Paolino di Pistoia, who later, because of the fact that his convent was twins with that of Santa Caterina, bequeathed them to it, making them travel back to Florence and eventually to Plautilla, where she would train by reproducing them. Later scholars like Corrado Ricci, Pierattini, Marchese would go on to find stylistic similarities between Paolino, Bartolomeo, and Nelli, but they would even go as far as to say that because the cloister rule was not enforced before 1575, Nelli could have likely been trained by Fra Bartolomeo in person, or she would have even gone as far as to say that she could have traveled to Pistoia to be taught by Fra Paolino in person. Also in view of the fact that the twin convents inhabited by male counterparts of nun were somewhat in moral charge of their fellow sisters. However, they would do well to remember the Bolla Affecto Sincero of 1267 that completely dispensed the friars of that moral commitment. And being that 300 years earlier, it could not have been the case. Moreover, if we judge the quality of her works, we see a plasticity, a rigidity, and a female quality to older figures, giving rather more substance to the idea that for which Nelly used to use, rather than mannequins and drawings, what was available to her for reference. Daily objects, which she could have used, for example, in her Last Supper that she made for the refettorio of the convent, and of course, her compagne, first and foremost. And this would also make sense, given judgments rendered by more modern scholars like Odoardo Giglioli, who in 1906 wrote regarding the attributed work of Madonna col bambino in grembo Santa Caterina e due angeli: la pittrice, segregata nel più gretto formalismo, non riesce a capire l'anima alata del grande Rinascimento ed a ricercare in se stessa una individualità artistica, which means that she couldn't really be considered a completely independent artist, but rather somebody who was very much embedded in the devotion she carried forth in her role as a woman of the cloth. Finally, can we consider Plautilla to be a trailblazing female artist? In the light of gender studies, no microcosm could be more interesting to study than convents and nunneries, where women would live out their lives with dignity and silence, tucked away from the world. However, in the light of the groundbreaking essays in 1971 by Linda Nochlin and in 1980 by Lamia Daumato, it is important to note that the exclusion of women from academic history was never due to lack of sources or testimonies, as we have seen, there are plenty, but due to an institutionalized choice, an unconscious bias, if you will. So addressing Nelli as the first female image maker of Renaissance Italy can indeed be correct, as it is, but correctly placing her within the context and forma mentis of the time, which included devotion and dilettantism, can help us reframe her more as an artifact, an instrument of domini, someone who indeed created, but was probably among the many scores of female artists and creators who did. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla, for introducing us to the exciting field of your research. First, I might have a question. Do you suspect, or have you any signs of any kind of network between female artists in Florence in the time of Plautilla Nelli, outside of the convent, of course?
As this is a research still in progress, I do hope to expand on that and actually expand my reach. So I do hope to find out more. That is the idea.